What would you do if the man you loved walked out on you after years of betrayal, leaving you with only your son to hold on to? But just when you think things can't get worse, the unthinkable happens. Your only son, your last hope, abandons you because of your broken mind. This is the emotional story of Mary, a mother left to suffer on the streets, and David, her son, who turned away when she needed him most. But fate has a way of turning the tables. What happens when the past catches up to David in a way he never expected? Mary was a woman known for her beauty, kindness, and dedication to her family. She married John, a man who appeared to be the perfect husband, a hard-working and charming individual who provided for his family. Together, they had a son, David, whom Mary adored and nurtured with all her heart. For years, their home was filled with laughter and love, and to everyone in the village, they were the ideal family. But behind the scenes, John had a dark secret. He had been having an affair with another woman for years. This betrayal remained hidden until one fateful day when Mary found out. She discovered letters and messages between John and the other woman, detailing a relationship that had been going on for far too long. Worse still, she found out that John had fathered a child with the other woman. The news hit Mary like a ton of bricks. Her heart, once filled with love for her family, shattered into a million pieces. She confronted John, hoping that he would show remorse, apologize, or even explain. But instead of guilt or regret, John coldly packed his things and left. He told Mary that he had no intention of staying with her and that he would be moving in with the other woman. Mary was left alone to face the crushing betrayal. The pain of her husband's infidelity, compounded by his abandonment, overwhelmed her. She tried to stay strong for David, but her mental health began to decline. The community watched as Mary, who was once a pillar of strength, started to lose her grip on reality. She would talk to herself, wander aimlessly around the village, and even forget basic things. People in the village whispered about her behind her back, calling her the mad woman. The weight of her broken marriage, the lies, and the betrayal became too much for her to bear, and soon Mary was no longer the vibrant woman she once was. Life took a drastic turn for the worse. Mary, now mentally unstable, was no longer able to care for the household. She couldn't hold down a job, and as the days passed, their savings quickly dried up. The home that was once filled with love and stability became a place of hardship and struggle. David, barely a teenager at the time, found himself taking on the role of the provider. With his mother's mental health deteriorating, he was forced to step into adult responsibilities far too soon. He dropped out of school to find work, but opportunities were scarce. Eventually, he resorted to selling small items on the street, snacks, fruits, and anything he could get his hands on, just to earn enough money for food. Each day, David would wake up before dawn, gather his goods, and head to the busy streets of town where he'd compete with other street vendors for customers. It was a tough life for a boy his age, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. While other kids his age were attending school, hanging out with friends, or simply being children, David was carrying the weight of survival on his shoulders. He would come home late at night, exhausted, with just enough money to buy a little food for his mother and himself. At home, things were even more difficult. Mary's mental state had worsened. She would sometimes wander out of the house, aimlessly walking the streets, talking to herself, or sitting in the same spot for hours, lost in her thoughts. David, struggling with the weight of caring for his mother, grew increasingly frustrated and bitter. He didn't understand why this was happening to them. His father had left without a word, and his mother was a shell of the person she once was. As the weeks turned into months, David started to resent his situation. He felt trapped. Every day was the same, selling on the streets, coming home to a mother who couldn't recognize the extent of his sacrifices, and facing the harsh reality that there was no escape from their poverty. The streets had become his classroom, and survival was his only lesson. The dreams he once had for a better future began to fade as he became consumed by the struggle of day-to-day life. David's frustration had been building for months. The weight of responsibility had drained him emotionally, and every day he felt more trapped in his circumstances. He had grown resentful of his mother's condition and the life they were forced to live. His anger had become a constant companion, and he couldn't help but envy the other boys in town who had their futures set and lived in comfort. David's life took an unexpected turn one hot afternoon while he was selling snacks on the street corner like he did every day. His mind was focused on the few sales he had made, worrying about how he would bring food home that night. Suddenly, a sleek car pulled up beside him. At first, he thought it was just another potential customer, but then he heard a familiar voice shout his name. David! He turned around to see Sam, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years, leaning out of the car window with a big grin. David's heart raced. Sam had visited his village briefly many years ago, and they had become close during that time, but they hadn't spoken since. Sam's family was wealthy, and seeing him now, sitting in the back of a luxurious car, brought a flood of mixed emotions to David: relief, embarrassment, and hope all at once. Sam stepped out of the car, looking surprised but happy to see David. "What are you doing here, David?" Sam asked, genuinely curious and concerned. David, feeling the weight of his poverty and the struggles he had been enduring, hesitated at first. But then he decided to tell a version of his story, a version that would earn him sympathy without revealing the whole truth. He explained that his grandfather, who had raised him, had recently passed away, and with no family left to turn to, he had ended up on the streets, selling what little he could to survive. Sam listened intently, and his father, who was in the front seat of the car, glanced back at David with pity in his eyes. "That's a hard life for someone so young," Sam's father said. After a moment of silence, Sam looked back at David and without hesitation said, "Come with us. You don't have to live like this anymore." David could hardly believe what he was hearing. Sam's offer was like a lifeline in a sea of despair. Without giving it a second thought, David accepted. That same day, he packed up his street goods, climbed into the car, and left his old life behind. He was welcomed into Sam's home with open arms, where warmth, comfort, and opportunity awaited him. David settled into his new life with Sam's family, but he knew he had to prove himself to secure his place. It wasn't long before Sam's father, Mr. Phillips, noticed David's strong work ethic and determination. Mr. Phillips, a successful businessman involved in the buying and selling of goods, particularly in the car parts industry, was impressed by how quickly David learned and how passionately he worked. David's time spent selling on the streets had given him valuable skills in negotiation and business, and Mr. Phillips saw potential in him. One afternoon, after observing David handle a particularly difficult transaction for the family's business, Mr. Phillips approached him. "You've got a sharp mind for business, David," Mr. Phillips said. "I can see that you're hardworking, and I like that. I was thinking, if you're interested, I could take you under my wing and mentor you. There's a lot you could learn in this field, and I believe you have the potential to go far." David was stunned. This was an opportunity he hadn't even dared to dream of. The chance to be mentored by someone as successful as Mr. Phillips was more than he could have ever hoped for. Without hesitation, David accepted the offer. Under Mr. Phillips' guidance, David threw himself into the world of car parts and imports. He learned the ins and outs of the business, from finding reliable suppliers to negotiating profitable deals. His ability to adapt and learn quickly impressed everyone around him. Within a few years, David was not just a part of the family business. He had started his own. He began importing car parts, then expanded into importing luxury cars, making deals that turned him into a wealthy young man. As his success grew, David's confidence soared. He could hardly believe how far he had come from the days of selling small items on the streets. But despite his rising wealth and status, he couldn't fully escape the shadow of his past. Meanwhile, David's mother, Mary, had been wandering aimlessly through villages and towns, her mind still lost in the trauma of her past. With no one to care for her, she drifted from place to place, surviving on the charity of strangers. Over time, her wandering brought her to the city, the very city where David now lived as a successful businessman. Unaware of her son's presence in the same city, Mary continued her life on the streets, a broken woman who had once been full of love and hope. She had no memory of how long she had been wandering, and every day seemed the same, a blur of unfamiliar faces and places. But deep inside, she still held on to the hope of finding her son, the one person she believed would care for her, even if her mind couldn't fully grasp the reality of her situation. David, wrapped up in his business and newfound life, had no idea that his mother was so close. The city was vast, and their paths hadn't crossed yet. One day, as David drove through the bustling streets of the city in one of the luxury cars he had imported, something unusual caught his attention. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman walking along the side of the road. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and her face was weathered with years of hardship, but there was something familiar about her. As he slowed the car near an intersection, the woman's eyes locked onto him. David felt his heart skip a beat as she began to approach the car. "David, David, my son," she cried out, her voice filled with desperation and recognition. David's chest tightened as he realized who she was. It was his mother, Mary, the woman he had abandoned all those years ago. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with fear and shame. He hadn't seen her in years and had pushed the memories of her to the farthest corners of his mind, convincing himself that he had moved on. Mary, with tears streaming down her face, continued calling his name. Her voice cracked with emotion, her steps shaky but determined as she tried to get closer to him. She recognized him, despite her broken mind, despite the time that had passed. She was still his mother, and she was still searching for the son she had lost. But David, overwhelmed by panic and the fear of being seen with her, did the unthinkable. Instead of stopping the car, instead of acknowledging her, he pressed his foot down on the accelerator and sped away. As he drove off, he caught a glimpse of his mother in the rearview mirror, her figure growing smaller, her cries fading into the distance. Mary stood in the middle of the street, watching as her son disappeared. Her tears fell freely now, the pain of rejection cutting through her fragile mind. She had spent so many years wandering, hoping to find him, only to have him run from her as though she were a stranger. David, his heart pounding and his mind reeling, drove through the city streets, trying to push the image of his mother out of his head. But no matter how hard he tried, her face, those tear-filled eyes, remained with him. The guilt that he had buried for so long resurfaced with a vengeance, but he quickly pushed it down, telling himself that he had no choice. He had worked too hard to build his life. He couldn't let the past come back to ruin it. Mary remained on the streets, lost and broken. Her days blurred into one another, and she wandered aimlessly through the busy city, ignored by the world around her. But as fate would have it, help came from an unexpected source. Emma, a kind-hearted and beautiful woman, often passed by the street where Mary sat. Emma had a generous spirit and couldn't ignore the sight of the frail woman who looked so lost and defeated. One day, moved by compassion, she decided to stop and offer Mary some food. At first, Mary was wary, unsure of who this stranger was or why she was being so kind. But hunger eventually overpowered her hesitation, and she gratefully accepted the meal. Emma didn't stop with just that one meal. She returned the next day with more food, and then the day after that. Each time she visited, she would sit beside Mary, talking to her softly, even though Mary often mumbled incoherently or seemed lost in her own world. Emma's patience and kindness slowly began to break through the walls that Mary's trauma had built around her mind. As the days passed, Mary started to open up. She spoke in fragments at first about her life, her past, and her son. Emma listened carefully, piecing together the broken bits of Mary's story. Mary told her how she had once had a family, a loving husband, and a son she adored. But her husband had betrayed her, leaving her shattered and alone. Her mind had started to unravel, and in her brokenness, she had lost everything, including her only child, David. Tears would often stream down Mary's face as she spoke of her son. David, he was all I had left, she would say, her voice filled with sorrow. But he left me too. I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he remembers me. Emma's heart broke as she listened to Mary's story. It was clear that Mary had been abandoned, not just by her husband, but by her own son, the person she had once loved most in the world. Emma grew even more determined to help Mary, not just by giving her food, but by trying to find a way to bring her some peace. Over time, Mary trusted Emma more and more, and the two women formed an unlikely bond. Emma realized that Mary's mind was still fractured, but there were moments of clarity when Mary would speak about her son with such love and longing that it was clear she had never stopped hoping to see him again. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Who was this David? Where was he now? And how could someone abandon their mother like this? She resolved to find out the truth, not knowing that the answers would lead her to a shocking discovery and to David himself. Emma was determined to find David. She asked around, trying to gather clues about his whereabouts, and over time she pieced together more of the puzzle. Through Mary's scattered memories, Emma learned that David had likely moved to the city and was now doing well for himself. One day, Emma attended a business networking event where she knew David would be present. As she entered the room, her heart pounded, but she kept her composure. When David finally noticed her, it was impossible for him not to be struck by her beauty. She was poised, confident, and had an air of grace that made her stand out among the crowd. Emma, ever so strategic, managed to introduce herself to David casually. They exchanged pleasantries, and David, immediately taken with her charm and beauty, was eager to know more about her. They continued to meet at various events and gatherings, with David always finding a way to be near her. Emma, knowing exactly who he was, but pretending otherwise, played her role carefully, not revealing her connection to his mother just yet. Over time, their casual meetings turned into conversations over dinner, and it wasn't long before David developed feelings for Emma. He saw in her the qualities he admired: intelligence, beauty, and ambition. It seemed like fate had brought her into his life, and he became increasingly smitten with her. Eventually, David confessed his feelings, telling Emma how much he admired her and expressing his desire to take their relationship to the next level. He showed her all the trappings of his success, his wealth, his business achievements, his luxurious lifestyle, and asked her to be part of it. In his mind, he had found the perfect woman to stand by his side. Emma, knowing the truth about David and his past, saw this as the perfect opportunity to teach him a lesson he would never forget. She accepted his advances, allowing him to believe that their relationship was growing deeper, all while continuing to care for Mary in secret. The irony was not lost on Emma. David was falling in love with the woman who was caring for the mother he had abandoned on the streets. Little did David know, the woman he adored was slowly preparing to unravel the lies he had built his life upon. After months of courtship, David and Emma were married in a grand ceremony, one that showed off David's wealth and success. To everyone who attended, it seemed like the perfect union. David, the wealthy businessman, and Emma, the beautiful and charming woman who had captured his heart. But behind the scenes, Emma carried a secret that weighed heavily on her conscience. Even as she moved into David's luxurious life, Emma continued to visit Mary, David's mother, who remained on the streets, struggling with her mental illness. Emma had grown even more attached to Mary over the months and knew that she couldn't leave the woman who had suffered so much. Now, as David's wife, she had more resources at her disposal, and she quietly used some of their money to arrange better medical care for Mary. Slowly, she sought treatment for her, hoping to help restore her to some level of stability. David, however, remained oblivious to what Emma was doing. Every time they passed through the part of town where Mary roamed the streets, David's reaction was the same. Whenever he saw his mother, dirty, disheveled, and speaking incoherently, he would pretend not to recognize her. It became a habit for him to insult her, calling her names like witch or madwoman in an attempt to distance himself from the shame of his past. He would roll up the windows of their car and curse under his breath, saying things like, "Look at that crazy woman. How does she even survive in this city?" The coldness in David's voice sent chills through Emma. She knew the truth, and it pained her to see how far he was willing to go to reject his own mother. Every insult he hurled at Mary only deepened Emma's resolve. But Emma's compassion for Mary continued. She arranged for Mary to be moved to a safer place, away from the dangers of the streets, and made sure she received proper care. She couldn't stand the thought of Mary suffering while she lived in luxury with David. Yet, every time David spoke about the crazy woman on the streets, Emma knew the day of reckoning was drawing closer. She loved David, but she couldn't ignore the heartlessness he showed toward his mother. She knew that the only way he would ever understand the depth of his betrayal was if he experienced something equally devastating, and she was preparing to deliver that lesson. David had built his life around Emma, proudly showing her off as his wife and making her the centerpiece of his social and personal world. Everything he did, from his business decisions to his social gatherings, seemed to revolve around her. He loved her deeply, or at least he thought he did. Emma's presence had become his source of pride, and he was convinced that their marriage was perfect. However, Emma had begun to drop subtle hints that David, caught up in his wealth and success, had failed to notice. She was growing more distant, though she still played the role of the loving wife in public. Her mind was occupied with the injustice she witnessed every time David ignored his mother, and the weight of her secret care for Mary had become too much to bear in silence. One evening, after they had returned home from a business dinner, Emma dropped the bombshell. Sitting across from David in their lavish living room, she looked at him calmly and said, "David, there's something I need to tell you." David, not sensing the gravity of what was coming, smiled and asked, "What is it, darling?" "I'm leaving," Emma said, her voice steady but firm. David's smile faded. "What do you mean you're leaving?" he asked, confusion filling his voice. "I've met someone else," Emma said plainly. "He's everything I've ever wanted, and I'm in love with him. I can't continue this charade anymore, David." David sat in stunned silence, his mind racing, trying to make sense of her words. "Someone else? What are you talking about? We're married. We have everything. Why would you want to leave?" Emma stood up and turned away from him. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and it's not yours." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His vision blurred as the reality of what she was saying sunk in. Pregnant, with another man's child. His heart raced, and he felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "But why?" David stammered, his voice cracking. "I gave you everything. I loved you." Emma turned to face him, her eyes hard. "You never truly loved me, David. You don't even know what love is. You can't possibly love anyone when you're so willing to abandon the people who need you the most." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I wanted to show you how it feels to be left behind, to be abandoned, just like you abandoned your own mother." David's world crumbled in that moment. The words, "your own mother," echoed in his mind. It was as if a switch had flipped, and suddenly, all the moments of denial, all the times he had pretended not to know the woman on the streets, came rushing back to him. The truth hit him harder than any business loss or personal failure ever had. You knew?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma nodded, her expression softening, but there was still steel in her voice. "Yes, I knew. I've been taking care of her this whole time. While you built your life around me, your mother, your real family, was suffering on the streets, and you looked the other way." David collapsed into a chair, his hands trembling. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had been so blinded by his ambition, his pride, and his shame that he had never stopped to consider the depth of his betrayal. Now, the woman he loved was leaving him, and the mother he had abandoned was still out there, suffering because of him. "I didn't know," David whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. He had known, deep down, all along. He had just chosen to ignore it. Emma gave him one last look, full of sorrow and disappointment. "Now you know what it feels like to be left behind. Maybe it's time you try to fix the damage you've done." With that, Emma walked out of the room, leaving David shattered and alone, realizing for the first time the pain he had caused not just to his mother, but to everyone around him. The days following Emma's departure were the darkest of David's life. He was left with nothing but his wealth, which suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. The guilt of abandoning his mother weighed heavily on his mind, and the reality of Emma's words haunted him day and night. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on his business, and couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he had to make things right. David knew that the first step toward redemption was to find his mother, Mary. He had no idea where she was now, but he had to see her. He had to make amends. With renewed determination, David began his search. He returned to the streets where he had last seen her, driving around aimlessly, hoping to catch a glimpse of her familiar figure. But Mary was nowhere to be found. His heart raced with fear. What if something had happened to her? What if she had been harmed or worse? He realized now, too late, how precious his mother was, and how deeply he had wronged her. As the days turned into weeks, David's desperation grew. He searched the city tirelessly, asking anyone who might know about the whereabouts of the mad woman who used to wander the streets. But no one had answers. One day, as David was about to give up hope, he received a message from a local clinic. The message came from an anonymous source, directing him to a place where his mother had been receiving care. The instructions were clear, and David wasted no time in following them. When he arrived at the address, he found a modest but clean and well-kept home. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door. A nurse greeted him and without a word led him inside. As they walked through the quiet halls, David's anxiety grew. He didn't know what state his mother would be in. He feared that he had lost his chance to make things right. Finally, they reached a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked open, and there, sitting on a comfortable chair by the window, was Mary. She looked different, clean, well-dressed, and more at peace than he had ever seen her. The wild, desperate look in her eyes had softened, and for the first time in years, she seemed calm. David's breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the room. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was his mother, the woman he had abandoned, and yet here she was, looking healthier and more stable than she had in years. As David stood there, stunned, the door opened behind him, and Emma walked in. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, watching his reaction. The shock on David's face was unexplainable. He couldn't understand how this had all happened. "I don't understand. How?" David whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Emma turned to him, her expression both gentle and firm. "I've been taking care of her, David," she said quietly. "I moved her here months ago, got her the treatment she needed. She's been healing slowly, but she's making progress." David's knees felt weak, and he sank into a chair. "I never knew. I thought she was still on the streets. I thought—" He couldn't finish his sentence, the guilt overwhelming him. Emma knelt beside him, her eyes filled with compassion, but also resolve. "I did this because I couldn't stand watching her suffer while we lived a better life. You may not have seen it, but I saw it every day. The pain she was in, the loneliness. She's your mother, David. She deserved better, and you knew that." David lowered his head, tears filling his eyes. "I was ashamed. I didn't know how to face her. I've been such a fool." Emma placed her hand on his arm. "I wanted you to understand what it feels like to go through that kind of pain. The pain of being abandoned by the people you love. That's why I left. Not because I don't love you, but because I wanted you to feel what she felt all those years." David looked at Emma, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, "for everything. I should have been there for her. I should have been better." Emma nodded, her expression softening. "It's not too late, David. She's still here, and she needs you now more than ever. You can make it right." David stood and approached his mother, tears streaming down his face. He knelt before her, gently taking her hand in his. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so, so sorry." Mary looked down at him, her eyes clouded with confusion but also recognition. For a brief moment, clarity returned to her, and she smiled weakly. "David, my son," she murmured, her voice soft and fragile. David wept as he held her hand, overwhelmed by the weight of his mistakes and the chance to finally make things right. Emma watched from a distance, knowing that David's journey to redemption had only just begun, but that the first step had finally been taken. Emma came home, and she and David lived happily ever after, united in love and redemption, as they continued to care for Mary. finally giving her the peace and care she had long been denied, healing together as a family and making amends for the past.